So my name is Jason Cruze, and I'm a doctoral student in clinical psychology at the California School of Professional Psychology. And so my interests are really in trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic growth, the sort of nascent field called moral injury. And my interest in this, in doing this webinar and being a part of this webinar, is to have conversation that's interdisciplinary. And so our panelists, it's, I think, very interdisciplinary. There's a policy maker, legal analyst, legal theorist, and also someone who's really on the ground working on criminal justice reform within the system. And so just to say a quick note, I forgot to step the timer, I'm sorry. But a quick note, really my interest in this webinar more personally comes from teaching in juvenile hall and teaching in prison over the past about 5 years. And yeah, my experience, it really, oh, how you doing? How you doing, Professor Armour? Good to see you.
Good,
just giving a brief introduction.
Right on.
So I think that my interest really began by teaching creative writing, ethics, critical thinking, philosophy at Central Juvenile Hall in downtown LA, and then being a part of a class, teaching a class at Norco Prison through the Prison Education Project. And what really stood out to me was just, you know, the background of where most, if not all of those inside came from, which was a lot of trauma, a lot of violence as a result of, you know, social, political, economic injustice. And so that really challenged me to rethink, you know, my moral standing, my position in society at large, right? So that idea of collective responsibility and also my own individual account or answering. And so with that, I'm gonna, just because of time, I'm gonna pass it on to my fellow moderator, Stephanie.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Modus. I am a PhD student in school psychology at Temple University. And prior to this, I received my master's in forensic psychology. So largely interested in the school, ending the school to prison pipeline, and particularly focused on students with disabilities and the intersection there. And that's a lot of my work. And I did reentry work at Rikers and other New York City jails in New York City, and really specifically focused on youth there as well. And I'm really passionate about this and the intersection of policy, and excited for this conversation and all these different things. And I want to also mention, I'm throwing this in the chat now for anyone who's interested, but we have as a graduate student committee, we have a producing policy webinar coming up in August, and criminal justice overall and just justice reform, however your interest intersects here, we would love for you to think about this. And if you're interested after this webinar, to sign up for this policy webinar, where we'll be leading you through creating different policy documents, a brief, an infographic, just different things. And then we have an opportunity that we'll be publishing it as a grad student committee if you submit it to us. So we'll be leading you through how to create that, and we'll break you off into groups. So if anyone's interested, feel free. The form is in the chat now as well, and it will be sent out to you as well after the webinar. So thanks everyone for joining us. Excited for this conversation.
And then Alan.
Yes, my name is Alan Chukwuhdi. I'm a master's student at the Boston School, currently at the Boston School of Psychoanalysis. I am involved in the Psychoanalysis Society and Culture program. I am also a Diversity at Large member for the Graduate School Committee, Graduate Students Committee of SPICY. My interests lie in history, psychology, psychoanalysis, and the intersection between those things and critical race theory. And for that reason, I was stimulated by the killing of George Floyd, and of course the the endemic racism of the United States, and I have decided to call it what it is, a societal psychosis. And I'm currently hoping that I can work with other psychologists and people in an intersectional way to develop some type of intervention for what I think is mental illness.
Great. So our panelists today, just to start with, Maritza Perez, she is the director of the Office of National Affairs at the Drug Policy Alliance in DC, where she leads the organization's federal legislative agenda and strategy. Previous to that, she was a senior policy analyst for criminal justice reform at the Center for American Progress, and her portfolio there included marijuana policy, policing, prison and sentencing reform. And prior to joining CAP, Maritza was a legislative attorney at the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF, and she began her legal career at MALDEF as a Soros Justice Fellow, advocating for policies to end mass incarceration. So each of these participants have a long bio, so I'm gonna have to shorten it a bit. But to say a bit more, so her portfolio is expanded to include immigration policy, employment rights, education access, and judicial nominations. Maritza earned her JD at UC Berkeley School of Law, where she received the highest distinction for her pro bono work. And she worked at the ACLU of Northern California and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where she conducted legal research on police and prison reform. And she was in 2019 named one of the Hispanic National Bar Association's top lawyers under 40, recognizing her outstanding record of public service and professional excellence. She is passionate about public service as well and justice for underserved individuals. She also currently serves on the Mayor's Advisory Committee on Child Abuse and Neglect for the City of Washington, D.C., and is a court-appointed special advocate for youth and foster care. And so I share your passion for working with youth and foster care as well. And Genea Richardson, we have with us, she works with a number of organizations. Specifically, she's the program director for the Healing Dialogue and Action organization that brings people together who've been wounded by violence and broken criminal justice systems. So Genea who's formerly incarcerated herself. She teaches and advocates for women in the women's prison to help acknowledge trauma, helps them to work through it and take responsibility for their actions. She works to restore community through restorative justice by reaching out to those who've been most affected by crime and injustice while incarcerated, to create atmospheres for dialogue that brings understanding to help people with their trauma and mend the needed bridges in the community. And so I'm really looking forward to just the wisdom and knowledge that she brings, and particularly her, what I would call her philosophy of listening for healing and fostering empathy. And so we also have Jody Armour. So Jody Armour is the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at the University of Southern California, and he's been there since 1995. And Professor Armour's expertise ranges from personal injury claims to claims about the relationship between racial justice, criminal justice, and the rule of law. And he studied philosophy and sociology at Harvard and then earned his JD degree with honors as well from UC Berkeley School of Law. And he's widely published, published scholar and public lecturer. And some of the journals include the Stanford Law Review, California Law Review, Vanderbilt Law Review, Boston College Law Review, among many others. His first book was titled Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, The Hidden Costs of Being Black in America. And his most recent book that came out last year, which we'll be talking about, I will call it End Theory, which is obviously different than its actual title, but he'll get into that. And Professor Armour is also an accomplished artist. He really, I think, holds to the importance of art for social justice, social reform. And he wrote and directed a play titled Race, Rap, and Redemption, which was produced by USC and featured performances by Ice Cube, Saul Williams, among many other artists. And he really is really a pioneer in spotlighting racial disparities within the criminal justice system, and also a vocal ally of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think more recently, a consensus builder on diversity issues at USC. And so just one fun fact that I found out while reading his recent book, in the foreword by Larry Krasner, he shares that Professor Armour actually held the Lower Merion High School basketball records for more than a decade before Kobe Bryant broke them during his own high school years. So yeah, I just want to say I'm very privileged to be a part of this conversation with the panelists as well as my co-moderators. And I think if you just look at some of the psychology on humanitarians, I think all of you really bring attributes of what it means to be moral exemplars. And so I have much respect for all of you, and I'm really looking forward to this critical conversation. So I'm going to pass it on to Stephanie for the opening question.
Yes, thank you. So just to start us off, I'm going to ask everyone really the same question to center us in this conversation. So starting with you, Professor Armour, if you could just tell us what matters to you the most in this work that you do and why. That's a hard question.
Oh, you're muted, Professor Armour.
I'm sorry. What matters the most to me in the work I'm doing is the kind of fact pattern I sickeningly see repeated over and over. Just the other day, I got yet another missive about a woman, Black, who was shackled to a bed in labor because she was incarcerated. And I was just thinking to myself, the way you have to look at a person to do that to that person, right? You're not seeing them as a person. Where are you going to run in the middle of labor? Where? There's no rationality to it at all. But you have to look at the object of that treatment as an object, not a person, as a thing, as something completely otherized. And that's what I've seen over and over in the criminal justice system. We have otherized criminals, which has made it easier for us. We've monsterized them, demonized them, which has made it easier for us to completely treat them in a draconian way. And just like so much toxic human waste, it just needs to be dumped somewhere, warehoused and forgotten and be damned. Who cares about the social consequences as long as our retributive urge is satisfied. Our lust for retribution, retaliation, and revenge is satisfied. And what I've seen over the last 10 years is a monumental shift in the Overton window away from that retribution, retaliation, and revenge moral framework toward restoration, rehabilitation, and redemption. It's been jaw-dropping. I could not have predicted the advent of the progressive prosecutor 10 years ago. Larry Krasner, Chesa Boudin, Chase, a Gascon down here in LA. So that is kind of what keeps me motivated. I'll just leave it at that now. That's what's driving me now.
Thank you so much. And now for the same question, Genea, what matters to you most in the work that you do and why?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I would like to start off with something that I read before I answer that question, because it just kind of sets the tone for what we're going to talk about. And it says, our ignorance of God, coupled with our ego's inclination towards greediness, makes us humans often unjust and unwilling to rightfully bear the holy responsibility of being God's just representatives on earth. The status God has granted the human being is not something we should feel entitled to, but a gift we should feel grateful for being given the opportunity to manifest. So that's what drives me. I want to be God's just representative on earth. I am a woman I understand poverty. I understand violence. I understand neglect. I have been incarcerated for 18 years, just recently came home. I understand what you were saying about society throwing us away into a place at our lowest points in our lives, and not creating a system that rehabilitates, but a system that just punishes and oppresses. So these are things that drive me. When I reach back out to my sisters who are still incarcerated, and I know they're laying on those bunks with tears in their eyes, wondering if someone sees them, if someone hears them, if someone cares. So this is what drives me every day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Genea. Really appreciate you sharing that. Maritza, I have the same question for you now. What matters to you most in the work that you do and why?
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having me here. It's really great to be on this panel with everyone. For me, my passion for the work that I do has always been driven by just my love for people of color and generally civil rights issues. My earliest memories were, civil rights issues. And I know that's maybe not what you would expect from like a kid, but I just remember being very in tune with that from a very early age. But I think that's due to the fact that I'm a, first generation everything. My parents were immigrants from Mexico. I grew up in a very rural, conservative, very white supremacist small town in northeastern Nevada. And, there was always this sense of feeling like a second-class citizen just because of my family's heritage, because we didn't have money, because of the language we spoke. All of those things were really frowned upon in my community. And I just remember from a very early age knowing that that was really messed up and just not right. And I also remember always just wanting to like find representation and something to hold on to, because I didn't identify with the community necessarily. And that really just exposed me to civil rights and, the struggles of other communities, including Black Americans, Native Americans, all of that. So I think for me, it's just been, again, a passion for people of color and for civil rights issues generally. I care deeply about marginalized people, and fighting for marginalized people, like those are my people. And I feel I have so much privilege, and I need to use that privilege to lift others up.
Thank you so much for that. Jason, do you want to take the next?
Yeah, thank you all for that. So I'm going to jump right in, Professor Armour. I want to get right into your recent book, and as I said, I'll call it End Theory. Could you tell us why you chose this title and what it means in terms of the moral and legal theories that you're critiquing in the book, and if you could, perhaps some personal background on the title and the work in the book that it's culminated, I think, about 15 years worth of research.
Yes, it's connected to my work going back over 15 years now with especially hip hop, so-called gangster rap. That was demonized in the 80s, late 80s and 90s. And I was part of a wave of people trying to stave off the folks coming with pitchforks to say, we're going to censor all this. Nas doesn't need to be saying what Nas is saying. Pac doesn't need to be saying what Pac is saying. Cube doesn't need to be saying what Cube is saying. In fact, they were locking Cube up. They were saying, you go out on that stage and say the words, Fuck the police coming straight from the underground. A young nigga got bad because I'm brown, not the other color, so police think they have the authority to kill a minority. You go out and say those words, clearly oppositional political discourse there, and we're gonna lock you up. And that's what they did, locked him up for uttering those words repeatedly, right? So I wanted us to, critically reflect on that when we're approaching at least the work I'm trying to do in the book, the power of language, the nature of language. My dad was given 22 to 55 for possession and sale of marijuana and only had language to get him out of that predicament. Was able to use language to write his own writs of habeas corpus and eventually triumph in a case called Armour Salisbury that I teach in my criminal law class now. So I wanted it to be a book about the nature of language, word work. I say to my students over and over, there are 4 occupations in America whose bread and butter is word work. That would be writers, poets, lawyers, and rappers. We stand or fall on the word work we do and what we're able to do with the language, like my dad, to, in his case, make his frozen circumstances dance by playing to them their own melody. The legal lexicon, drawing on that and finding new possibilities in it that hadn't been there before he found them in his brief and argued them in his case. So that's part of the reason the N-word is in the title, to constantly provoke that critical reflection on the nature of language and word work and the malleability of meanings and how meanings are, prizes and pitched battles among social groups trying to identify, establish their social identities and vindicate their social existence. So there's all that, but there's also Chris Rock's use of the damn word. When he launched his comedic career back in '96, with a routine called Bringing the Pain that was real popular in a lot of households. He goes back and forth in front of almost all Black audience in Chocolate City saying it's like a civil war going on in Black America and 2 sides, there's Black people and niggas gotta go. I love Black people, but I hate niggas. Boy, I wish they'd let me join the Ku Klux Klan. Shit, I'd do a drive-by from here to Brooklyn. He goes on like that for 20 minutes. His core definition of a so-called nigga being a Black person who's done a crime. By that definition, up to 90% of young Black males in some of these inner city neighborhoods who are going to wind up in jail, on probation, on parole at some point in their lives are morally condemnable N-words. That's what you're saying. That's what we're laughing at. That's the political invitation that we are vindicating in your punchline by laughing at it. So I want to draw on that sense of the N-word too, to attack that moral distinction between so-called bad Negroes and good Negroes, as Randall Kennedy of Harvard Law School would call them, in the more genteel language of the academy, or in the more blunt language or vernacular of the street, so-called lovable Black people and morally condemnable N-words. So that's kind of the project.
So, Professor Armour, then you're saying that essentially what you're doing is you're attacking the use of the N-word as a way of kind of demonizing Black people because of a record of criminal wrongdoing. Is that correct?
Yep, that's one way I'm using it. Absolutely. I'm saying when you use it in that way to denigrate, yes, I'm attacking that. But I'm also saying when Tupac says in his Solidarity Dirge, how many brothers fell victim to the street? Rest in peace, young nigga, there's a heaven for a G. I'd be alive if I told you that I never thought of death. My niggas, we the last ones left. He's using the N-word not as a term of moral condemnation like Rock was using it, but as one of solidarity, of a term of endearment, a recognition of your humanity that the others outside our group don't recognize.
Okay, so in your book, you criticize the dichotomy between good Black people and bad Black people, or African Americans and niggas, N-I-G-G-A-S. So can you explain this more, like the criminalization of being propelled by what you call the retributive urge? Can you explain that more in connection to Black Lives Matter and respectability politics?
Oh yeah, great question. Respectability politics is the heart of a lot of this, because one of the big tensions between the civil rights generation leadership and Black Lives Matter activists that I saw develop while I was here, in LA in 2013, 14, 15, and saw how Black Lives Matter activists were being responded to by traditional civil rights, kind of generation political folk. A lot of times they were being met with antagonism, Black Lives Matter, because they were not embracing a politics of respectability that the earlier civil rights generation embraced, right? One in which you say that it's important how the Black community looks in the eyes of whites. We want to make sure that we look respectable in the eyes of whites, that we maintain our racial reputation. So when they make judgments, policy judgments about us as a group, they're going to make good, positive policy judgments. They're going to give our interests weight because they're not going to view us or vilify us. They're not going to view us as less. They're not going to lowball our interests because of our negative racial reputation. So that's the whole kind of politics of respectability framework. I understand why people thought it was effective in the 50s and 60s, but what Black Lives Matter said was, you know, we shouldn't have to put all of these victims who police shoot in the back, unarmed people, or shoot, period. They shouldn't all have to be, you know, respectable, morally upright, you know, Dudley goddamn do right, morally immaculate in order to deserve to be treated like with the respect of a human being, right? Yeah, so what Eric Garner was selling Lucy's, which was against the law. That should be irrelevant to his being snuffed out. You know, so what Walter Scott, when you shot him 6 times in the back, hadn't kept up on his child support. You know, you shouldn't have shot him 6 times in the back, you know, irrespective of the politics of respect. The victim, the icons of the movement don't have to be these, you know, respectable Negroes. You know, they can be real human beings with ordinary human frailties, and we can love them and embrace them just the same, right? So that was the big, I would say, is the big difference.
Okay, so if I'm understanding you correctly, that seems to be very much illustrated in how the treatment that insurrectionists were given on January 6th and Black Lives Matter protests were given just for protesting the murder of George Floyd. So I told you previously that I work in the intersection of critical race theory, history, and psychology. And with that in mind, keeping in mind the history of the law and its enforcement, the 14th Amendment and Reconstruction, and the debate about citizenship, I would ask you, are African Americans truly citizens of the United States, or are we colonial subjects?
Wow, man, hey, look, I cannot deny, you know, I'm a law professor. I'm supposed to be about the rule of law. You know, I'm supposed to be about, you know, supporting the rule of law. And so as a law professor, I suppose I'm supposed to answer that question by saying, yes, we are citizens because we get the benefit of the rule of law, deserve the benefit of the rule of law. You know, I'm supposed to say something like that, but it's hard for me to keep a straight face and say and talk about the rule of law when we see these travesties of justice constantly going on all around us, right? And so when you ask about citizenship and whether you're a citizen, well, okay, 1857, Dred Scott said, the Supreme Court said, Black people we're not citizens. We don't have any rights that a white person has to respect, okay? I got that, and by the way, all of you people who argue for the marketplace ideas, that's where we should just let, you know, anybody say whatever they want to say because the truth is going to rise to the top and the marketplace ideas. Dred Scott should be a sobering reminder that the marketplace of ideas don't often, a lot of times don't produce truth, right? Dred Scott said, people like me have no rights a white person has to respect. And it took 600,000 dead Americans in a cataclysmic race war to end slavery. Not good ideas trumping bad ideas. But, you know, going on to your a basic point about citizenship. So we were supposed to have been given citizenship as a result of the Civil War, right? But then we had racial apartheid. That's what we call Jim Crow. You know, second-class citizenship. I guess you could call that a form of citizenship, but it's a very diluted, frail, anemic kind of citizenship that many of us had all through that 100 years of Jim Crow, racial apartheid, American style. And now, you know, you can have a Black man shot 6 times in the back, like Walter Scott, on a video. Or you can have a Black man like Rodney King beat repeatedly, savagely to a pulp on a video. And in both cases, in the Rodney King case, the Simi Valley jury acquitted the first time around. And in the Walter Scott case, they deadlocked, right? So I don't see that as a state, as a criminal justice system that is treating its Black people as citizens. You know, if citizens mean you get basic fundamental rights like you would expect to get, you know, when a video showed that kind of wrongdoing by state actors against citizens. But so yeah, you kind of got me. I'll say this though. You know, I have to get up in the morning with some sense of optimism. I have to believe that we can fight for greater citizenship. I know you can attack me as being a Pollyanna about that. So I'm not, but that's, you know, that's kind of where I've seen some progress. I see, you know, Measure J down here, which is defund the police measure, up to $1 billion a year going to incarceration alternatives. Just came in at the ballot box because of grassroots activism by Black Lives Matter and their activist George Gascon came in. So I got to be somewhat hopeful, but I hear what you're saying.
Thank you so much. We're going to transition a bit, Genea, to the important work that you're doing. So we'd love to hear about what you're doing in terms of repairing harm to communities through restorative justice. If you can describe for our audience what it is and how it can really help foster healing and moral repair. And from your own experience, what do you think restorative justice looks like in practice?
Thank you. So yes, I work with Healing Dialogue in Action, which is an organization that is based on restorative justice principles. So restorative justice is the opposite, of course, from just locking someone away. That's your justice, that's your criminal justice. So restorative justice, it's powerful because it reconnects humanity at its most vulnerable points. And from my own experience, like I said, I was incarcerated. A lot of times we're just wondering, hey, are we forgotten? Hey, are we humans? We didn't just wake up one day and say, hey, I'm going to commit this crime. So restorative justice shows the face of humanity. So it brings together communities as opposed to tearing apart communities, because the system is based on tearing things apart, of separating the two. So restorative justice allows people to see each other, to see, hey, this is my circumstance, this is my situation, this was my lot in life. It doesn't make an excuse, but it gives a reason why. So a lot of people just want to understand why. And once they begin to understand why, then they see us as humans. Then they see us that we can contribute. We can be our most valuable selves in society. It just takes someone to care. It just takes someone to come in and say, hey, what's your story? What's going on with you? What happened? So restorative justice is powerful in that aspect because, like I said, it mends those bridges. And so when I was incarcerated, I know that they have the symposiums that come in. So the symposium actually allows survivors of crime to come in and sit in circle with people who have committed crimes. And what happens in those circles is hard to describe physically because it's something you just have to witness, the healing power that happens in those circles. So what you do is you tell your story and they tell their story. And then you see that pain is the common factor that connects everyone. And so it just allows this flow of healing to go through both parties. So the survivors leave with being feel to a certain extent. I'm not saying like the first time or the second time, but I've been a witness, I've sat in circle and I see that people leave full because they begin to understand the dynamics of how things are operating in life. It's not just, oh yeah, those are criminals, throw them away, they're sitting in the trash, those are the most horrible people. You will find some of the most beautiful people incarcerated with these jewels and treasures that come into society and just help everybody. I mean, there's not a place that you can't sit and just be in self. When you're incarcerated, you're able to pull your soul out of your body if you choose, and to look at it and examine it and begin to understand why. And so when we come into society, we have a clear perception of the direction that we need to go. We understand people's pains. We understand what people are going through. We see people. A lot of people in society are just walking every day, not seeing people. And this is what brings humanity together. This is the key. Because how are we going to go forth in life if we're just going forth as individuals, just busy, 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 not seeing each other? So the power of restorative justice is just, it restores communities. It really does. And once we have a whole community, then we're able to raise our kids with better than what we did, because we understand. So that's what I do with restorative justice, is going to the prisons. We help those who are incarcerated. We reach out to people who have been survivors of crime. And I saw firsthand, it changed my mother's lives. It changed the people's lives around me. And so they begin to have a new mindset and a new perception that goes forward and saying, hey, we need this. We don't need to just be throwing people away. We need to be helping people to become their best selves. We need to be creating a community that gives people that safe space to become their best selves. And so that's what I've witnessed restorative justice does in my life, because I'm firsthand witness of that in the lives of people around me. So I'm very passionate about this work, because I feel like that's what we need. The world is lacking connectedness. So
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing your own personal experience. That was so well put and everything. And now, Maritza, we'd love to bring you into this conversation in terms of what sort of policy structure would need to be in place in order for restorative justice practices to offer an effective alternative to really this retribution kind of in our current structure. And do you really think that restorative justice is compatible with retributive justice? And why or why not?
That's a really tough question, because I actually don't think it's a policy change. I think the policy will come after we have a cultural change. I think, the mindset that we have when it comes to the criminal justice system and retribution, and also just how we, dehumanize people of color, all of that is connected. And in order to change policy, you have to change people's mindsets about all of that. I think, one thing that people keep talking about throughout this is just the dehumanization of people, of Black people in particular, and other people of color, and how because of that, it's made it so easy to have this really retributive system that disproportionately impacts people of color. I think this is why the Black Lives Matter movement is just so important. It's literally the words Black Lives Matter. Like, the impact of that is just saying that these are people we have historically dehumanized, and we're reminding people of the core humanity that we should keep in mind with everyone. I mean, dehumanization is really how you can justify treating people terribly. We've seen this time and time again. I think that probably like the most stark example of that is with the Holocaust. That was years and years and years of dehumanizing people of Jewish heritage, but it's, what we've done here for centuries when it comes to the rights of people of color and people of color in this country. So, it's really tough. I also work in DC, and it's very slow moving. It's really conservative. Both sides of the aisle are very conservative, in my opinion. So it's really, really hard to affect any sort of progressive policy change. I mean, so I work at the Drug Policy Alliance. We work on criminal justice reform, but also drug policy reform. And we can't even pass federal marijuana reform. And that should be like low-hanging fruit at this point, just to give people a sense of like, how slow things really change at the national level. But what helps is cultural change. And, I think that's why it's so important that we have people outside of, these people in DC who work at think tanks and are policymakers and politicians, because that's not culture. Like, I really have learned that being in DC, like, what matters is the movements, like the Black Lives Matter movements. What matters is art, television, books, the literal just humanization of oppressed people. That could really start to pave the way for actual policy change. But I still think it's going to be a while. It's just really depressing to see that happen in DC. We've seen on video time and time again at this point, the murder of Black and brown people at the hands of police. And how has DC responded to that? Very slowly. Finally, we might have a police reform that's currently being negotiated, But, I'll tell you what, that bill is going to be very watered down. And even to get that watered down bill, it took literally thousands and thousands of people dying at the hands of police, hundreds of which were captured either, on video or in photos. And yet, we still even haven't gotten any sort of justice there. So things are very, very slow moving. And it's, it's really depressing when you think about just the trajectory of how slowly things move, but it can happen. It happens with these types of conversations. It happens with reminding each other of our inherent humanity. It happens by, again, just using human and people first language, not thinking that we can throw away people, that people are all disposable. I feel as an advocate on the Hill, that's my job, reminding people we're talking about people who are incarcerated, people who are just as involved, people first language, people with families, people who deserve a second chance, all of those things. So yeah, slow moving change. But I really do think in order to get to that policy change, we need a cultural shift. And like I said, these conversations and everything that folks in this panel are doing really contribute to that.
And if I could just quickly interject before we move on to the next question. Professor Armour, if you could bring it back to this concept that you call the retributive urge. So it's a two-part question. One, as you lay out in the book, there's a lot of legal theorists. It seems to be a moral and legal norm to defend retributivism. And, I think I said that I consider myself a fellow blame skeptic with you. But I'm wondering what your, obviously there's a slew of responses, but one that might come up that I hear is, well, if you do away with the retributive urge entirely, then you risk undermining the values that have been violated by the perpetrator. Yep. And understand, these terms, perpetrator and victim, are controversial, but for the sake of this conversation, I'll use them. And I'm wondering how you think of upholding those values and safety and protecting victims and survivors without the necessity of blame, without the, in the philosophical literature, the reactive attitudes, the retributive sentiments. And then just the second part, the question of, do you think that it's retributive justice could be compatible with restorative justice? If you could comment on that.
The latter, no. The former, now, I'll come back to that, but the former, this is why we have to eradicate the retributive urge at its roots. It cannot be left in no vestige, no relic, nothing. We've seen that down that road, racial injustice lies. How much more do we have to be hit over the head with this? 30, 40 years isn't clear enough? Okay, yes, I understand this argument about the retributive urge, that people, here's where you see, especially people on the left who are otherwise incarceration skeptics, who are otherwise are decarcerationists, here's where you see them often fall into incoherence. When a victim is from a socially marginalized group and a victimizer is from a socially dominant group, right? When that happens, all I hear is off with his head, off with her head, right? I don't want to hear nothing about no restoration, redemption, rehabilitation. We should be talking about just off with his head or her head, whoever it is. And I say the price of principle is consistency. That's the price of principle, is consistency. So that means when Amber Geiger goes in, as she did, the white Dallas police officer, and shot Botham John while he was sitting on his couch eating a bowl of ice cream, right? And many of us said, I lost followers and friends behind this one, right? In the name of consistency. A lot of people said on my timeline, she should get murder. Nothing less than murder will be justice. A murder conviction and murder time, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, off with her head, right? Now, what she did was was negligent. No question about it. Criminally negligent. I don't have any problem with that. She got off on the wrong floor, thought that her apartment was not her apartment, thought there was a home invader, went in, shot the wrong person. Criminal negligence, recklessness. You even got recklessness, no doubt. All of that means manslaughter. What that means is typically manslaughter. Why do we need murder? What is the thirst that we're slaking, satisfying by getting the murder part of the conviction, right? She's still going to be locked in a cage for years potentially, right? Go in one of those cages for 6 days. Don't tell me even about 6 months or 6 years, right? And so, but you know, what I heard over and over again is, oh no, the way you show you care for victims from socially marginalized groups is by punishing their victimizers as harshly as possible. That expresses your care and concern for those members, right? We gotta break that habit. That's what got us Jessica's Law, Megan's Law, all these various laws where there's always a vulnerable victim, and here come, you know, this monster or ogre, and we're pitting them against one another. And the next thing you know, we have what we're trying to climb out of, you know, the new Jim Crow.
And so just to quickly follow up, you also talk about what we could call the classical, one of the classical defenses is to also say that, well, if we do away with blame, then we inevitably are undermining the dignity of the offender. And I wonder if you could respond to that as well.
Oh, yeah, you know, you have to, the only way you can show respect to a person, these philosophers say, the only way you can show respect to a person is to punish the hell out of them. Because if you don't respect their choice, if you don't say you made a bad choice, and so now you're gonna have to suffer for your bad choice. If you don't do that, you're not respecting their person. If you accept any excuse, like provocation, extreme emotional distress, disadvantaged social background, any mitigation or excuse is disrespecting them as a person, right? And somehow treating them as a thing rather than as an autonomous actor who makes choices, blah, 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 right? At the same time they say all that, we can look at our conventional morality and recognize there are lots of excuses throughout the conventional morality we routinely recognize for one another, right? We recognize for ourselves and one another all the time, right? So, and it's a matter of sympathetic identification, whether or not you find an excuse persuasive or not. We can get into all of that stuff if you want, but this wholesale rejection of excuses, this wholesale rejection of making any allowances for ordinary human frailty is not how the law works, it's not how morality works. It is just some, you know, some kind of philosophical exercise that people like to sometimes get into.
Yeah, I really apologize for another follow-up, but I think it might be relevant. But when I read someone like Anthony Duff's criminal law theory, University of Minnesota, I believe, he's arguing that, you know, it really sounds he's almost coming to your side in your overhaul of retributive punishment. But he says that there is something in retributive punishment, and he pulls from religious ideas like a sort of secular penance that we can apply to restorative justice, perhaps for the sake of, you know, educating and helping the offender understand the harm that they've done, so that they can understand how to authentically apologize and play a significant role in making amends to the victim. And I'm wondering if you have if there's any plausibility of that idea.
Well, you just changed from retributivism. You can go ahead and start talking about secular, you know, expiation, secular absolution. You can go talk about that all you want, right? You've left retributivism and you're saying now the criminal law should play some expressive function when it comes to something like expiation or absolution or whatever, when what it's supposed to be focusing on is one thing only, retributive justice, and that is just deserts. That is subjective culpability, that and that alone. And once I shoot that down with the phenomenon of moral luck and show that it's irrational and illegitimate to make those moral judgments, those kind of praise and blame judgments, then I've taken the very foundation from any retributive move at all. And now all you have left is some expressive function. And I'm saying, no, that's not a sufficient reason. You cannot sacrifice people on the altar of the common good. You cannot engage in that kind of hunger's logic when it comes to blame and punishment.
Thank you for raising that. We'll come back to the luck issue. And then Alan, did you want to have the question
Yeah,
for?
I was going to say that I actually agree with, in order to have restorative justice, and I'm thinking of restorative justice in its true sense, which is in its African sense, I agree with Maritza that there has to be a cultural shift here. There certainly has to be. So I am not so sure that we could actually even have truly a system of truly restorative justice in the socio-cultural framework of capitalism. And I want Ms. Perez and Mr. Armour both to think about that. But I want to ask Ms. Perez specifically, in understanding the racial history on the war on drugs, do you think that, how can you tell us more about the things, the persistent, intractable kind of elements in our culture, the current culture that we live in, the American culture, which is racist, the things that keep BIPOC people or people of color, that lead to their incarceration and keep them kind of tethered to the cycle of incarceration and this retributive justice?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so something that I think is that a lot of people may not know about really is that the war on drugs' very foundation is a racist history. Literally, the first drug laws in the US were created on the backs of people of color, beginning in the late 1800s, where we saw all these anti-opium laws start to pop up in California specifically, and those were targeting Chinese immigrants who were, becoming a threat to labor. Actually, people saw them competing with white folks, so they started to criminalize opium, which was consumed by Chinese immigrants. And they started to, pathologize it and say that, they're, using opium and luring white women into these opium dens. And this is the first time we started to see these laws pop up. Around the same time in the South, we saw laws around cocaine starting to pop up, really attacking Black men in the South. These were Black men who were laborers, but it was a way, after slavery, to keep men entrapped in, the system of slavery, essentially, because, it was the convict leasing system. It was people who were incarcerated and brought in with charges that were made to continue to work for free. And then similarly, around the beginning of the 1900s, we saw something similar happen with Mexican migrants. And that's really the first time that we saw anti-marijuana laws on the books. In fact, before the early 1930s, cannabis was often referred to by its scientific name, cannabis. But it was around the turn of the 20th century where where the government wanted to criminalize Mexican migrants, that the person who was in charge of drug policy at the time started to refer to it as marijuana to make it sound more foreign, make it sound Spanish and scary, and tried to give it a criminal association. So it's really interesting because, that's just like the beginning of our drug laws. And we know that, with every president that came, especially I would say beginning in the 1900s, built on the war on drugs and continued this criminalization of people of color specifically. If you think about, all of the drugs that have been the most demonized throughout history, that demonization has disproportionately fallen on the backs of people of color. And, what's interesting about that too is that if you look at drug use rates, drug use is common across demographic groups, across racial lines. There's no evidence showing that people of color use drugs at, with more frequency or at higher rates. In fact, there is, statistics showing the opposite is true, that they actually use drugs less. But, we are the people who continue to get policed and incarcerated for drug use. Drug possession continues to be one of the most, if not the most common reason that people are arrested and introduced into the criminal justice system. And again, think about it, people use drugs at similar rates across demographic groups, but it continues to be Black and brown people who are criminalized for this. And there's a slew of reasons for that. But I've always seen it as a way that the federal government has been able to keep a strong control over people of color and has continued to, police them and really take away people's civil rights, because that's what happens when you're put into the criminal justice, system. So at the Drug Policy Alliance, we work to end drug criminalization We work, our main goal is to just decriminalize all drugs and eventually get to a place where we could regulate drug use. But we're very conscious of the fact that, the drug war has been and continues to be fought on the backs of people of color. So all of the policies that we propose and all the policies that we fight for, we always think about restorative justice. We always think about reparative justice. We always advocate for bringing back revenue and systemic change to communities of color. One thing that I found interesting earlier when we were having this conversation about whether the criminal justice system, whether retribution is enough, when I think about retribution never brings about systemic change. It reminds me of, the Chauvin trial with the George Floyd murder. If you think about the fact that you're just punishing one individual,
Right.
in some ways, I also think that lets the system off the hook, because then we're not having the conversation about systemic change. And that's really bothersome to me. I think retribution to me doesn't make sense for a lot of reasons, but I think that the thing that's most annoying to me is that the system is off the hook. We don't have to have the hard conversations about systemic change. And, systemic change, I think, could actually really bring about justice. For me, justice would be putting resources back into the communities that have been defunded, making sure that when people are released, that people have access to jobs, that people have access to good paying jobs, healthcare, all of these things. But we can't really have that conversation if we're stuck on, if we're stuck on individual actions. I see this as a systemic wide fight, and I'd really like to have that conversation.
Yes, I think that's such an excellent point. In so many of our systems, when everything's just put on an individual, it's really easy for the conversation to shift from all the change that needs to happen on a systemic level. So that's so important. I want to also shift to an issue that is often overlooked in these conversations. So specifically for you, Genea. So incarceration and reentry have largely been designed for men in the US. So what are some of the unique needs of women who are incarcerated, and what are advocacy and policy efforts that others can support for this population?
Yeah, so that's what I always say. The system was created by men for men. We know that from the dawn of time, our system has been messed up. It's and a really good friend of mine said recently that the system is working at its best because this is how they created it to work. So it's working at its best right now, which is to do everything we just talked about, to oppress people, to throw people, to keep empower those that be empowered. That especially women, like you said, you can't put people in a place and just have them sitting there. It's going to foster the darkest parts of them. You have to appeal to the light that's inside of them. So being a woman, a giver of life, being in a system that was created by men for men, where we're surrounded by brick and concrete and hardness, and you're stuck in a perpetual state of PTSD on a daily, you're in hypervigilant status, you're looking around you, violence is happening all around you. Women are givers of life. We were not created. No one was created to be in an environment like that, but a woman who is supposed to be soft, a woman who is supposed to be, and not soft in the sense of, that aspect, but soft as far as feminine. It balances out the universe. The earth is feminine. These things are feminine. We have to cultivate. When you're cultivating the earth, you're cultivating the feminine that creates and produces life. So if you're throwing women into a hardened place, what do you think that that's doing to the woman's psyche? What do you think that that's doing to her soul? It's crushing it. So I was in that system. I had 26 to life. I was in there for murder, robbery, and by the grace and glory of God, people like you who fight for laws to be changed have changed laws, and now I'm sitting here able to advocate for the women that's still inside, for the women that's still incarcerated. So I think that the whole system needs to be redesigned, of course, but this is a fight we've been doing for so long, especially for women. We need other things than just being in a system of punishment. We need things that's gonna appeal to bringing out those best aspects of us, things that teach us, things that educate us, things that heal us. So, I mean, I'm still new to this, so I'm still trying to find all the resources. I'm still trying to find, like, I've only been home 9 months. So I'm actually still in my reentry, still trying to unwrap my mind from that system of incarceration. So things come to me, but so I don't have a bunch of things that I can say, hey, go here and go here and go here. I'm just saying this conversation that we're having is bringing awareness. Being connected to people like Maritza, being connected to people like Dr. Jody Armour here, just learning and seeing what can we do as a people? What can I do? What can I contribute? So just having these conversations, being able to be a part of this conversation, to bring awareness, to speak on behalf of the women. And there's a lot of organizations out there that's advocating for women and doing for women and fighting for women. So that's just, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. So.
Oh, yeah, thank you. And I think also, even though you say you're new to this, you have so much great experience and so important to share. Like you are speaking for a lot of people, and the voices of so many people that are lost, and that's so important in this conversation, and it always is so important. So thank you. And now, Maritza, I just want to bring you back into this a little. So you've also worked on this issue, specifically the need for sentencing reform for women and mothers. Can you just help give us some perspective on how mass incarceration actually drives reproductive oppression?
Well, that's a really, really good question. Yeah, so, women are actually the fastest growing group of incarcerated people. And as Genea said, I mean, first of all, like, nobody should be a part of a system that's so abhorrent. But I think for women, there are particular issues, especially when it does come to like reproductive justice and just basic healthcare. Like, these are things you can't get in you can't get in the prison and jail system. Like, we know that. In fact, prison and jails are actually very well known for the lack of healthcare, the lack of attention that they pay to individuals. So, we also have in this country a really sorry history of making sure that people who are incarcerated or people who are otherwise unwanted, including people with disabilities, aren't able to reproduce. In fact, the government has sterilized women. Like, they did this in Puerto Rico, they've done it in California. They did it very recently in California, in fact, with Black, Indigenous, and Latina women who were incarcerated. And it's a common thread. It's like people who are, unwanted, quote unquote, by society. And putting people in those systems is a form of, ensuring that they can't reproduce or have access to the things that they might need. I feel like Genea might have something actually should probably add to this, because I have not been incarcerated. Everything I know is just from my role as an advocate. But maybe I'll pass the mic to Genea to speak a little bit more about this.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. At one point when I was in Chowchilla, there was a doctor there that was sterilizing the women, and how he was doing that was by giving them hysterectomies. They recently did a documentary about it with one of the ladies who were formerly incarcerated. I believe it's called The Belly of the Beast. But that shows how they were sterilizing the women. And yeah, the medical is horrible in there. You will it's better to just, we self-medicate ourselves. We'll say it's better to just take aspirins and lay down, or try to make as much home remedies as possible, because once you're going to the medical, that's it. They're misdiagnosing you. They're not giving you the proper care. They're telling you that you're making up your symptoms, and they're not real. I would dread getting sick in there. I remember one time I had this awful pain, and I never found the source of it. They took it, and by the grace of God, they took me to the doctor, because the guard can attest that I wasn't a person that was going to the medical. So he said, oh no, she never goes to the medical, because he said that there was something wrong with me because he knew me because I had been there for so long. That's the only reason why they saw me. And so they ended up giving me a pain shot, sending me back. The end result was I never knew what happened to me, what was going on or anything. So yeah, the conditions, the mental health conditions is horrible. They put people inside of your cell. For number one, women live 8 to a cell. That's illegal in the first place because the cell is no bigger than a small little studio. It's crazy. And so they always getting fined for having these extra beds in the room. So we're stuffed in there. And then you have people with mental health problems that don't need to be incarcerated, that they're putting inside of the rooms with other people who don't have any idea how to deal with mental health people. So then there's these crazy dynamics, people getting harmed in all kinds of different ways because nobody is equipped to deal with this types of stuff. So, I mean, I can just go on and on and on about the horrors that I've seen in there and the injustices that happen in there, especially women. You know, women need certain needs and surgeries and just different types of things that it's all being neglected when women are going through menopause. I mean, there's certain needs that you have. Who's able to deal with these things if no one is properly caring or tending to or understanding the problems? Mothers, oh, that's a heavy subject in there too. So it's horrific. It's no place for a human being, let alone a woman, like I said, who holds life inside of her womb. So, I mean, I don't know if I've answered your question, and if you have more, I can go on, but I don't want to take up the space with talking about all the horrors.
Today we actually have a follow-up question for you based on motherhood, and it's from the chat from Julie. So it says the research shows that the majority of mothers who are incarcerated are the primary caretakers of their children. And so based on your own experience and people you've been incarcerated with and just people you know overall, what kind of supports do parents who are incarcerated and particularly mothers need to reunite their families after they're released?
Oh yeah, that's one of the biggest things in there because majority of the women that's incarcerated are mothers, and 98% of their worry is their children. And some mothers it's consumed because they like they said, they're the primary caretakers. So they're in there and they're wondering what's going on with my child. They're trying to understand how to still parent being incarcerated. That's a big thing too. They want to keep that connection. Children are getting taken, put in the system. They're being with family members that's not caring with them. So they need support. They need a way to stay connected with their children. They need some type of understanding of how can I parent, because now they're just beating themselves up daily. Like, I'm the worst parent ever. I can't, my child is this, my child is that. So they need a way to teach them the dynamics of how to still parent, how to still be present, how to still, just help their child through this most horrific time of their lives. And then a lot of women need help when they get home. They're not horrible parents just because they committed a crime that has nothing to do with their children. So, but their children have gotten taken away for certain reasons. And so they need a way, they need resources that's going to help them to get their children back upon release. Because when you're released, there's so many things that you have to worry about. It's like a baby coming out of the womb, especially if you've been incarcerated for so long and things change so much. We're so behind when it comes to technology. We don't have any paperwork. We don't have documents, just a lot of stuff going on. So imagine if you have a child that you have to now worry about when you come home, like, how can I get my child back? How can I parent? How can I do this? It becomes overwhelming. Just recently, I became overwhelmed coming home, trying to learn everything, trying to understand, trying to take my mind out of that prison mindset. Not saying that I was institutionalized in my mind, but my body has been incarcerated for 18 years. I have been doing the same thing on the same cycle for 18 years, not being exposed to experience. What does experience do? Experience cultivates the soul. It helps people to understand who they are and what is their purpose. What am I supposed to do? So I'm sorry, I don't want to go on a tangent, but yes, Women need help. They just need some type of something that's going to help them to understand how to be a parent during my incarceration. I need people need resources. Their children now suffer because I was a sole caretaker and now I'm in here, and who's making money, who's helping my child, who's supporting my child. And this is how incarceration continues to happen, because nobody's supporting these children, and now they're going out and they're trying to learn on their own, not understanding how to do this, and then crime begins to happen, and so on and so forth. And we already know about the communities that we come from. I'm from South Central LA. We don't want to talk about that though, right? So they just need help. They need people to step up to the plate and say, here I am, I'm a helping hand, I'm a resource, come to me. What does your child need? What do you need? So
okay, I want to switch gears for a moment and go back to Professor Armour. And I want to talk a little bit about the end theory. Specifically, Dr. Armour, could you speak a little bit about the role of the cognitive unconscious, or that is implicit bias, in the use of law enforcement and the application of the legal system? Also, can you give us some specific examples or arguments that are about how that you have in your book about how society and legal decision makers view ends as blameworthy, thereby justifying the retribution that they are subject them to?
Yeah, thanks. My early work in the legal literature, my early scholarship was on unconscious bias. And before people were calling it implicit bias, we were talking about bias rooted in the cognitive unconscious. We were taking information processing approaches to human cognition so that we could really kind of drill down, zero in, and say, outside of, because before I started writing in this area and a few other people, there was a Freudian model of the unconscious that people weren't buying unless you were already buying Freud. So we had to come up with models that you could replicate in the lab and all that. And so, that was done. And I was going around the country talking to police departments, corrections officers, everybody I could. This is in the early 90s and mid 90s until late 90s and early aughts even, bringing the gospel of implicit bias, unconscious bias, that it's there, it's a thing, number one. And number two, these unconscious mental reflexes, once we know they're there, we can engage in self-regulation so that we can control this prejudice habit that we're all subject to, right? So I was going around thinking I was, doing good. And now I've realized over the last 5 years, when the new data has come in and made it abundantly clear that, yes, it's true that implicit bias, unconscious bias is ubiquitous. Yes, it's deeply ingrained. All that is true. What's not true is that we can do much about it, that we can regulate it very much, that we can control it very much. There is very little we can do about it, all right? And what that means then is, if you have a group of people like the police, let's start there, but let's start with the police. And these people are your assigned violence workers, because that's what police are, violence workers. We give them a Glock with live ammunition, a stun gun, mace, a billy club, handcuffs. They are tools, or those of violence workers. So when you take these violence workers with all these unconscious biases that they cannot self-regulate, and you connect them to, you have them engage with members of stereotype communities, like Black communities, then the consequences are abundantly, deplorably foreseeable, are they not? Right? Over and over, you're going to have what we have. So the way that you resolve this problem, we've come to see, and it's been a bitter pill for me to swallow, but I've had to repent of a lot of the crap stuff I was saying earlier, that we could all come together around controlling our unconscious biases. Just not true. What the conclusion that you come to is that since you cannot train it out of officers through implicit bias training and all that, you're not going to train unconscious bias out of officers. The only way to minimize harm between violence workers and members of socially marginalized groups, stereotyped groups, is by minimizing those contacts. That is, unbundling the police. There's no reason police should be pulling people over for air fresheners hanging from their rear view mirrors. They shouldn't be in that business in the first place. There's no reason they should be responding to mental health crises or going down here in Skid Row and solving the houselessness problem by cracking down on the down and out. There's a whole lot of interactions with the community that the police don't have to make. Defund them, or if that's too triggering for some, unbundle them. Okay, unbundle them so you minimize the contacts between them and members of stereotype groups, and that's the only way you're going to minimize the harm to those stereotype groups from those violence workers.
But we then go back to the statement that Ms. Perez made, which is about having a culture shift. And so I'm going to go out on the limb here, and I'm going to ask you, can these things come about if we don't untie the legal system as we know it from capitalism? And what I mean is that capitalism drives the prison industrial complex. The bottom line is dollars and cents to some degree. So these violence workers, as you were speaking about, they're serving a purpose. So can we change the legal system without untying it from capitalism?
I hear what you're saying, and I think you're right. You know, I think ultimately, if we're really talking about abolition, to get to abolition, we're going to have to do something about capitalism, just to get all the way to abolition. Yes, no, I can't deny it. You know, because what police do is, and Mark's pointed this out, what police do is protect property interests, right? They really protect a status quo that may be rooted in savage social inequality, and that part of their, purpose is to make sure that, however unjust the basic social structure is, even if it is intolerably unjust to members of society, that there is still law and order, and they move people who are, viewed as social problems into the receptacles of our social failures we call jails, right? And so they're always going to kind of play that role. But I think we can at least reduce some of the harm that they're doing right now by, number one, stop criminalizing so much stuff. Why do we criminalize so many things, right? We criminalize, when I first started teaching criminal law in '95, I had to teach my students all the way to 2003, 6, 7, 8, 9, 2001, 2, 3, that it was constitutional in a number of states for the federal government, for rather the state government, to come in and tell a same-sex couple who is exchanging intimacy, you're felons and we're going to throw you in a cage. Same-sex intimacy was a felony in a number of jurisdictions. Think how, some of my students now look back on that and they think that happened like 150 years ago. That must be ancient history, right? We have all these laws that, with the homelessness, we decided in LA in 2006, we were going to solve the homelessness problem by something called the Safer Cities Initiative, cracking down on them for their own good, because the problem of homelessness, of course, according to them, was their lack of personal responsibility, not the lack of affordable housing, not the lack of jobs, not the lack of adequate health care, but the lack of their own personal responsibility. So the police went in, wasted hundreds of millions of dollars. Google this Safer Cities Initiative, it jumps right out. Hundreds of millions of dollars they spent cracking down on the houseless for their own good, to no effect. There's more houseless now than ever. It's exploding every all around us constantly. And so, and I'll just say one more point real quickly now to bring this current. We got to we got to recognize whenever there's that kind of logic of prohibition, we have to attack it. You know where I see it now? Menthol ban. Here we go again. Here we go again. Okay, we're going to create a black market, an illicit market, right? The same one that killed Eric Garner. We have a clear example. Eric Garner, Lucy, and that's just on taxes. Don't talk about banning it and how much it's going to go up. And we see what's going to happen, right? When we go down this prohibitionist road. And yet I'm sitting talking to Black groups yesterday on the radio the day before, people saying, oh no, this is in the interest of Black people to ban menthols. This is really a racial justice and social justice thing that is done for the sake of Black people. No, white people continue to get to smoke all they want to smoke, their favorite brand, without any interference. It is Black people's desires and preferences, 85% of whom smoke menthol, that Black people's preferences and desires and vices that we need to paternalistically police for their own damn good, right? And going to create this whole a problem that we've just been talking about with prohibition, right? So we got to learn lessons from history.
Thank you.
Professor Armour, I wanted to have one more follow-up, and then we'll have a few concluding questions and bring in the audience. I apologize, we've gone over a little. So in your book, you reference Tommy Shelby's important work in Dark Ghettos. And in short, his argument, I think, it clearly also depends on abandoning the retributive theory of punishment, right? And he describes the injustice suffered from those who've experienced severe social oppression within society as something that undermines the moral standing of the state to punish. And I think in his view, if I get it right, the defendant may even deserve punishment. Obviously that's different than your view, but the state wouldn't have the moral authority to deliver it. And so this is an argument appealing to hypocrisy. And I'm wondering what your comment is on it and how end theory addresses this predicament in the criminal law.
Yeah, I didn't get to get into this. It's coming out in my next book. I left this, it was going to be a chapter, then it got to be too big a chapter, so I had to leave it out. And it goes to this very question that you're raising, and that is, when is the government or state responsible for crime, for example? When can we say, yes, there is a higher crime rate in the Black community, for example, in street crimes and certain kinds of crimes, and that is just true. But that crime can be traced to social causes, right? In other words, there are a lot of people who are coming from the politics of respectability perspective who don't know what the hell you're talking about when you say there's a new Jim Crow. You sit down, you say, you know, even 5-10 years ago, even today, you sit down and say, you know, that all of this racialized mass incarceration problem, all these disproportionately Black bodies who are locked up in these jails are a civil rights issue akin to Jim Crow. This is the new Jim Crow. And they'll look at you like, what are you talking about? They have nothing to do with Jim Crow. They would say Jim Crow was about innocent Negroes suffering social oppression. That's what they would say. You had Martin, Medgar, Rosa, you had morally innocent Negroes who were suffering social oppression over which they had no control. Over here in the so-called new Jim Crow, they will say, you have Black criminals, often violent, who are making choices to often prey on the most vulnerable members of their own community, and more generally, to cause criminal harms. How can you compare them to Rosa, Martin, and Medgar? You know, they'll say, I don't see it. One is a victim of social oppression. The other is a victim of self-destruction. That's what they will say. And you know, I've heard that, I'm saying it because I've heard it so many times. You know how many times I've run into this. This is in the popular culture. And you have to be ready to take this argument completely out. We're at a moment where, you know, I think we started to see through it. I've tried to bring the argument home in my book, but here's an example of how it's important for us to bring this dimension home that I didn't get into in the book. The crack plague in South Central, where I'm living. Yeah, they don't like to call this South Central View Park, but you know, it actually is. It's up in the hill. You go right down the hill, suddenly it's South Central. You go up, oh, it's View Park. I don't know what the difference is, but people try to distinguish the two. And it is socioeconomically, it's a whole set of issues to go into. But what happened here in LA was we had a raging crack plague. we had a lot of crime, we had a lot of homicides, we had a lot of robberies associated with the crack plague. Can't deny any of that. But what we also had was Maxine Waters out here in 1996 and Deutsch, the sitting CIA director, flying out of the safe confines of Langley to land in LA and go to a town hall meeting in Watts with Maxine Waters and 800 angry Black folk in Watts who said, what the hell is going on with the CIA Contra connection and the jump starting of the crack plague by going around the Bolin Amendment and going after the Sandinistas through Colombia, Nicaragua, and into Rick Ross here in South Central, as Gary Webb pointed out in his Dark Alliances series, which the CIA ultimately admitted to, by the way, folks. I thought just conspiracy theory stuff, which they admitted to, folks. So there you have a clear case of where you actually have the government as an accomplice, as an outright accomplice in the very crime that they are prosecuting a whole generation, hobbling a whole generation of Blacks for committing, the very crimes that were serving foreign policy. So they were prosecuting their own accomplices, right? But you didn't see any of that because all we were thinking about was the subjective culpability of each individual drug dealer or what have you, and not the government's complicity in it. So it's that level of analysis that I think we're going to have to get to and stay on, so that we're able to see that there is social oppression in self-destruction, so that we're able to say to the people who make the argument that I don't see any comparison, any moral analogy between the old Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow. One is about social oppression, the other is about self-destruction. We can say to them, no, what you're missing is that self-destruction can have in it social oppression. You can have the seeds of social oppression in self-destruction. That's Durkheim's key point. Durkheim's great insight, right, in suicide, right? His great sociological work, suicide, is I'm going to take even the most personal act like a suicide and show you it's actually a social fact, not merely an individual psychological fact.
Thank you so much. We're going to be getting to wrap up, so I want to ask a question to all of our panelists, so all of you will have a chance to respond to this, and whoever wants to take it first. But so really just the focus here is we know there's a large overlap in those who are harmed and those who have harmed others. So thinking about this kind of in the restorative way also in this framework, what do you think could effectively challenge the dominant cultural and legal narrative that survivors' interests are inherently opposed to the interests of people who have caused harm? And really, what relationship does healing and responsibility have to each other in your own experience? Whoever wants to take the question first.
I can go ahead and start. Yeah, this is a really good question. So I think I'll go back to what I said at the beginning about how cultural change is so important to this. I think people might have noticed that, I would say probably within the last few years, the criminal justice reform movement has become more of a phenomenon. In fact, I don't even think criminal justice reform was like in common lingo just a few years ago. And I think about like why that changed and like why that happened. I mean, this has always been a deeply unpopular issue. People have been doing this for decades and decades and decades. And it wasn't until very recently, last few years, where people started to like really come around and see that this is an actual problem. And I think about why that is. And I think a lot of that actually has to do with formerly incarcerated people telling their stories and being out there, in front of policy, being in leadership positions, and in that process, humanizing themselves. And I think about this, I always compare this actually to what we've seen with the immigrant rights movement. So I've, had throughout my career the pleasure of working also on immigrant rights issues. And, I think about the Dreamers, and these are children who were brought to the United States undocumented, and their parents are also undocumented. And, the immigrants' right movement was really led by Dreamers who came out of the closet, so to speak, and said, we're here, we're undocumented, we're not going to be afraid to say that, and started to really challenge the system And I think that helped people really see that, you know, dreamers aren't something that we should be scared of, or these people we shouldn't be scared of them. They're just like us. They're our neighbors, they're our coworkers or colleagues. And I see the same thing has happened with the criminal justice reform community. You see formerly incarcerated people, justice involved people who are coming out and saying, I was system involved. This is my experience. This is my background. You know, this is, you know, how I got to where I got to. And I think that really does help, because otherwise you're talking about a boogeyman, especially in our culture where we have for so long really and continue actually to put people who are system involved down in many ways. And we've taken away like their basic humanness. So I actually think that is really powerful, and that needs to continue to happen. Like, I'm very pleased to see that today on this panel, Genea is joining us. I think it's really important that directly impacted people are telling their story, telling their experiences, and are at the forefront of policy change. Because if we can make that connection and remind each other of our humanness, then, you know, I think that we can see that we've all been on one side or the other. We've all been people who have experienced harm, but we've also, each of us have also put harm in the world in other ways, right? And I think just people telling their stories is just so critical to this work.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that brings me back to what I said in the beginning about restorative justice. Not only am I a part of Healing Dialogue and Action, but I'm a part of LARP, which is Leaders Academy Reentry, a part of the TPW, which advocates for groups inside of the prison, a part of Angel City Urban Farming. So, and these organizations, this is what they're doing. They're allowing the formerly incarcerated to have a voice, to be a part of the decision making, to be a part of the laws that are changing, to actually put our input, because I feel like that's what was lacking at the table. Everybody's making all of these policies and all of these rules, but they're not asking the people who's directly impacted by these things. And so it always makes me a little bit emotional that because I was, and I don't want to keep saying this, but it's the truth, I had 26 to life. I was never supposed to be sitting in this seat. So for me to be on this panel after serving 18 years and just being home after 9 months, it really makes a difference. This is why I'm so passionate about restorative justice, because like you said, it humanizes people. It shows that we're not the monster or the super predator, because I was a juvenile when my case happened, and this narrative that they try to create and how the media tries to demonize people who, you know, are incarcerated. So just by creating the conversation, like she said, by allowing us to have places at the table, by allowing people to share their stories, by allowing people to see that they're human. You know, when people suffer a crime, of course they're hurt. Of course they want, like someone said, off with your head and all of these things. But when we show that everyone is human, that everyone has flaws, everyone goes through things. Just because I may have been sitting incarcerated, there's things other people doing who they're never going to be incarcerated, but they're doing more horrible things than the next person. But the point of the matter is that we're talking, we're coming together, we're showing that everybody bleeds the same. Everybody has a story. And then we're highlighting situations that show why we are incarcerated, as far as poverty, as far as, you know, just the oppression, as far as the negligence of the community and the mismanaged funds and all of these types of things. We're bringing all this to the light. So by bringing these things to the light and having these conversations, like I said in the beginning, we're mending communities. Yeah, we may not be able to change the world in one day, but it only takes one person to make a difference. So when one person rises and say, I dare to speak, this is what changes things. So I thank you for this opportunity sitting here today. And that's my answer. I'm going to keep going forward, keep being a voice, keep trying to help the people that's coming after me. And I'm going to show our humanity.
Thank you so much, Genea. And I want to echo, I don't know if you've been seeing the chat too, but your voice is so important. And someone earlier said you really are an expert in this. So I think that's so important to highlight. It can get lost in the chat, but I think that's really incredible. And thank you for joining us. And then Professor Armour, if you just want to add to anything in this conversation to this question as well.
Well, I guess the final thing I would say is I would connect. We know there's going to be another Willie Horton case. We know that any criminal justice reform we engage in is going to have some error rate, because all human enterprises have some error rate. There's none that don't, right? And so that's going to happen. There's going to be some outlier case like Willie Horton was. Over 99% of that furlough program had no incident. And literally over 99%. It's not like me just exaggerating when you look at the numbers on the program. But that outlier of Willie Horton haunted a generation when it came to criminal justice matters. And we can get another one of those outliers any day, anytime. And the question is going to be how we respond to it when it comes along. We know it's coming, or they are coming. Then how are we going to respond, right? And I think that we have to, do stuff that's uncomfortable in order to get ready to respond. And part of that means, being consistent even when it hurts, paying the price of principle, which is consistency. So, in a case like Derek Chauvin, right? I think there's a whole lot of people on the left who felt the retributive urge inflamed, stirred strongly when it came to Derek Chauvin. I know I certainly did, right? And I write about not giving into it and all this stuff, all that high fluting stuff. Man, I felt it in my, I just viscerally, but, at least this, however you come down on Derek Chauvin, whether you think he should be convicted of murder or manslaughter, I would say manslaughter, a couple years, for anybody in a cage is going to be enough. I'm not a complete abolitionist. I think he should go into some kind of incapacitation for what he did, but I wouldn't make it anything like the years for murder. And I would change the conditions of confinement so they were more like those, over in Europe, where they're more like dormitory rooms rather than sardine cans and all that. But at the very least, you should find it completely wrong for Chauvin to have been convicted of murder on the basis of the felony murder rule. Because the felony murder rule is a bad rule, and it's mostly used against disproportionately Black folks. It's a bad rule. It allows you to be found guilty of murder for having murderous mens rea, even if all you had was negligence at most, or even not that. But still, you get stepped up mens rea and liability for murder just because it paves the path of the prosecutor. Prosecutors like it, so they keep the felony murder rule around. Scholars hate it. Academics talk about it. Judges talk badly about it, but it stays around. So we should not be celebrating Derek Chauvin getting a murder conviction on the basis of the felony murder rule. Maybe on the basis of depraved heart murder. Okay. That's separate. That's different. But that's not the felony murder rule, which hurts Black. So that's the kind of systemic thing that I think we need to be careful of. I'll just kind of stop it there.
So we're just about out of time, and I want to thank all of our panelists. And I want to say that, Frantz Fanon gave us a way to think about the motivations behind the criminalization of the other. And with tonight's panelists, that also allows us to think of a way that we can address this societal psychosis, and of course, the racial PTSD that people of color have been subjected to. And I want to leave with that and ask all of the participants to think more about the societal psychosis and what we can do, each of us, going forward.